Greetings, students. Now we are finally getting to the end of Meditation 2. Remember, I set aside the end of Meditation 2, which we call the wax meditation, last week. It's a particularly important stretch of text, so I set it aside and I said we would do it this week, right? So here we are. We're going to have a lecture just on the wax meditation. Then I'll have a lecture in which I make the briefest remarks I can on meditations 3 and 4, and then I'll have a more elaborate lecture on meditation 6. Okay, so I thought a slideshow would be helpful here. I think you'll see why when we get to the next 2 slides, right? It's just important for you to see the setup, see the conceptual setup. I think you'll get that as we go through it. Okay, this is a particularly important stretch because as we go into it, we've already learned that the mind is better known than the body, but we get a reaffirmation of that really important point from Descartes from a different point of view. So that makes this stretch of text important. It allows us to see the extent of Descartes' rationalism. That is to say, Descartes' metaphysics depends partly on his conceptual analysis. In a related vein, this bit of text, the wax meditation, shows that the external world has to be understood through the lens of mathematics, or put differently, when we do the conceptual analysis of the wax, we do get something mathematical. We end up with geometrical / mathematical concepts, and you'll see what I mean by the time we get to the end. Again, in a related vein, we do learn something important about Descartes' metaphysics. By the time we get to the end of the wax meditation, dualism has been established, right? So Descartes is known for mind-body dualism. In the wax meditation, we get clear on what body is. So that's half of the mind-body dualism, right? We got clear on the nature of the mind in the first part of meditation 2. At the end of meditation 2, we get clear on what body is, and that finishes our picture of Cartesian dualism or mind-body dualism. All right, for us, the wax meditation, it begins on page 102 of the Shapiro and Lascano textbook. So if you look at page 102, you go to the right-hand column and you look at the first full paragraph there. That's where the wax meditation starts, and it runs through the end of meditation 2. Okay, so let me read a bit, and then we'll look at these lists that I've put up on the screen for you. Let us consider those things we commonly believe we understand most distinctly of all. That is, the bodies we touch and see. Not indeed bodies in general, for those general perceptions tend to be somewhat more confusing, but rather one body in particular. For example, let us take this piece of beeswax. It was collected from the hive very recently and has not yet lost all the sweetness of its honey. From there, he goes on to describe the wax in terms of its sensory properties, right? He's trying to appeal to all the senses, all the sensory modalities. So he's basically just listing these attributes, these properties that the wax has, trying to take account of all of our senses. So let's look at the list here. Before the wax is melted, it's sweet. It tastes of honey, right? It's just been taken from the hive. So, of course, it tastes of honey. It smells like flowers. right? Because the bees, they go and they collect pollen from the flowers and they go back to the hive. So we can smell the flowery scent. It's got a definite color, right? It's a bit white, it's a bit yellow, it's opaque. The light doesn't go through it very well at this point before the melting. It has a definite shape. I assume it looks like a honeycomb because it just came from the hive, right? So that's where this wax is coming from. It's hard, it's cold. You can wrap it with your knuckle, you can strike it, and it makes a sound, right? So that covers all 5 senses. Now Descartes melts the wax, and what happens? Well, the sensory properties change. After the melting, there's no discernible taste. We can't taste anything. There's a sort of blunt taste. Well, you've probably had a crayon in your mouth at some point when you were a kid. There's a dull, blunt taste. I don't know what to call it exactly, but certainly doesn't taste of honey. It's not a very definite taste. It's lost the smell as well. It is now translucent. The light can go through it somewhat. It's losing the yellowness, turning white. Maybe you could find someone actually melting wax from a honeycomb online. Probably, if you wanted to look, you would see what happens there. It had that definite shape of the honeycomb. Now it's getting amorphous, or I put in parentheses, blobby. It's just losing its definite shape. It doesn't have a new definite shape. It's not got great definite boundaries now. It was hard, it's soft, it was cold, it's warm. If you try to tap it or wrap it with your knuckle, not much happens. You're not going to hear much, right? It would just soften and absorb the blow. Okay, so it seems that all the sensory properties have changed. Okay, so what's the significance of that? I think the best way to figure out what the significance of the melting wax is to state these 3 propositions. These propositions describe what we've just been through, at least in our minds, right? If we didn't actually melt wax, we just went through Descartes' descriptions. So consider these propositions that frame the situation for us, and consider how, well, they don't all go together. It seems as though they can't all be true at the same time. And that means something will have to be given up. One of these propositions will have to be rejected, nullified, right? So they all seem to describe the situation at first, but since there's a tension, we're going to have to let one of them go. Okay. First of all, we believe, right, again, we're describing the situation here as we see it. We believe we are presented with the same piece of wax at the beginning and the end of the process of melting. Number 2, all the empirical or sensory properties we observed as belonging to the piece of wax at the beginning of the process of melting were replaced with completely different, sometimes opposite properties by the end of the process of melting. So we've got, looking at number 1 and number 2, we've got the same piece of wax, but a completely different set of sensory properties at the beginning and the end of the process of melting. And then finally, we know the piece of wax and other seemingly external objects through the senses. Are we seeing the tension yet? So here's a piece of wax. We know it through the senses. And here are the sensory properties. We listed them. They all changed, and in fact, some of them became the opposite of what they were, right? Hard to soft, for instance. So we know the piece of wax through the senses, but all the sensory properties changed, but we want to claim it's the same piece of wax. So this isn't adding up, right? You want to say, well, if it's the same piece of wax and we know the piece of wax through the senses, then some of the sensory properties stayed the same. Or alternatively, look, we only know it through the senses and all the sensory properties changed, so it's not the same piece of wax. Okay, so Descartes needs to resolve this tension. Let's look at the next slide. Now we see that Descartes resolves the tension by rejecting the third proposition. So he wants to insist that this really is the same piece of wax. That's what people would say if they watched it melt. You know, if you asked them, is it the same piece of wax, they would say yes. If you asked them, how do you know, they'd say, well, I just saw it melt, right? And so Descartes wants to go with that intuition. Yes, it is the same piece of wax, but we saw a tension, right? We saw some kind of contradiction that needs to be resolved. Descartes is resolving it by rejecting that we know the piece of wax through the senses. So this is counterintuitive, right? It is an external piece of wax. Let's be clear on that. I'll say a little bit more about that later. It's supposed to be out there. The doubt is a little bit set aside for the purposes of this thought experiment, or at least for us it's a thought experiment. Maybe Descartes actually melted some wax while he was writing this, I don't know. But in any case, the doubt is just set aside for now. We're entertaining, this experiment involving the piece of wax, and we're taking it that we're talking about a piece of wax out there. I would invite you to look again at the text if you're not sure about that, right? So what we're saying is external objects, to be clear, are not really known through the senses. There's an inspection of the mind that has to occur for us to uncover what an external object really is. I'll jump the gun a little and say, well, it's extension. But extension has to be understood with the intellect for reasons we'll discuss when we get to another slide. For now, we're just saying, okay, Descartes has to give up. He knows he has to give up something. He's not going to give up on it being the same piece of wax. So he will give up on this idea that we know the piece of wax through the senses, right? And then that tells us how much of a rationalist he is. He is presenting this as an external object, and he's saying that we don't actually know it through the senses. We thought we did, but that doesn't work. So there's actually an inspection of the mind that has to be involved to know the external object, and not just this external object, but any external object. I thought it would be interesting to jump ahead and think about what David Hume would say. I don't know of anywhere that he comments on the wax meditation specifically, But he certainly read his Descartes. He certainly thought about Cartesian themes and conclusions. So we do have to take him as responding to Descartes to some extent, whether that's explicit or not. Okay, and David Hume insists on the very thing that Descartes rejects. Hume insists, in other words, that we only know objects through the senses. We don't know anything else about them. There's no other knowledge there. So he's very much an empiricist. He is somewhat explicitly rejecting rationalism, right? We don't know anything through pure reason. Okay, so Hume ends up rejecting, again, not commenting on the piece of wax specifically, but he certainly would, if you asked him, say, well, it's not the same piece of wax, right? We only know things through the senses. We just watched all the sensory properties change. It's not the same piece of wax. That is Hume's general view about external objects. In general, he has the view that, well, the sensory world is in flux, right? Every day it looks different, right? The lighting changes. We're getting far enough toward the fall equinox to get that autumn light in the mornings, certainly, and in the evenings, right? The longer shadows, you might have noticed. Every day things look different somehow or other, right? That's just part of it. So we're just dealing with different objects every day. They don't look exactly the same from day to day. The wax doesn't look exactly the same at the beginning and the end of the process of melting. So we're just dealing with different objects every day. We have this sort of fiction of stable objects that we need to deal with the external world. So we have this sort of practical view that objects stay the same. We need them to stay the same to deal with them. That's what makes it a practical view. But in theory, philosophically speaking, everything's different from day to day, right? So it's not the same piece of wax. Now you know a little about David Hume, even though we haven't read any Hume in this course yet. Now we're elaborating on what we've learned. And I want to use this particular frame. There are different ways to frame our takeaways and our conclusions. I want to frame it in terms of epistemology versus metaphysics, right? This is an upper division philosophy course. Most of you have taken Introduction to Philosophy. I wish all of you had. I don't know that that's true. But, you know, this distinction between epistemology and metaphysics is quite basic in philosophy, right? These are different branches of philosophy. So epistemology is about what can be known and how we can know things. Metaphysics is about what exists and how it exists, its nature, its essence, right? And Descartes, of course, once I've explained what epistemology and metaphysics are, I'm sure you can see Descartes is definitely making epistemological and metaphysical points, and we have to keep them separate or we'll get confused. Okay, so in terms of epistemology, as we've said, the piece of wax is known through an inspection or perception of the mind, right? We don't know that it's just extension, which is the metaphysical side of it, except by inspecting it with the mind, because if we just observe it, it looks like a bunch of sensory stuff. But we did however you want to put this. Sometimes Descartes uses the word judge, which I actually find a bit problematic. We judge it's the same piece of wax, he says. There is some kind of mental activity going on through which we connect this bundle of sensory properties at the beginning of the process of melting to this different bundle of sensory properties at the end of the process of melting. I wouldn't call it judgment, I would call it synthesis, right? Because by the time you get to Kant, Kant is talking about an ongoing synthesis, and it's inspired by what Descartes is doing in the Meditations ultimately, right? So our mind synthesizes this bundle of sensory properties with this different bundle of sensory properties because it knows, oh, that bit of extension, you know, is in the same time-space coordinates as this bit of extension with completely different sensory properties, and we didn't see it move. And so the mind, unbeknownst to us, if we haven't read any Descartes, synthesizes the different sensory properties so that we see them as belonging to the same underlying extended substance. But in any case, when we say the piece of wax is known through an inspection of the mind, that is an epistemological point. If we thought it was a metaphysical point, then we would think, perhaps wrongly, that the wax is subjective. But it isn't. I've already said it's out there, it's an external thing. It's just that we know it through mental activity, which sounds weird, but that is Descartes' view. Major evidence that it has to be known through an inspection of the mind. Well, I was just talking about synthesis, so that's some major evidence, but Descartes doesn't even use that word, synthesis. So what's his major evidence? Well, he brings up infinity, a certain limited kind of infinity, not the kind God has, to be clear, since maybe you've already read the third meditation by now. But there's a certain kind of infinity at work here. The wax is perceived as infinitely flexible, taking on an infinite number of shapes, potentially, and infinitely changeable, right? We could change its volume or its location. We can certainly change its sensory properties. How much can we change them? Infinitely, it seems. We don't really know where the boundary is, so it's infinite. But infinity itself is not a sensory attribute. Infinity is something we understand, but infinity is not something we perceive, right? Because our sensory faculties are themselves finite. Our senses are finite, and yet we perceive the wax as infinitely flexible and infinitely changeable. So we're really getting at the wax and what the wax is through the mind, not through the senses. Okay, that's epistemology, or at least most of what I said focused on epistemology there. Metaphysics, the piece of wax is a bit of extension. That is to say, the piece of wax is the taking up of space, right? So as I put it here, the essence of the piece of wax is exhausted by its taking up space. That is what it is. If we get rid of the accidental properties, if we uncover the true nature of the wax, what we're dealing with is the taking up of space, right? So as I say on the slide, it does have other properties, but these depend on its extension or its taking up space, right? So we can see the piece of wax, so it has a color and a visible shape, but that's because it's taking up space. And so photons are bouncing off of it, and they're bouncing off of it in a certain way because of its microstructure, and that's making it visible, but essentially it's taking up space, and so it's visible, right? We can see how that works. I hope, I think. The evidence here seems to be, right, what's our evidence that it's a bit of extension? In other words, the evidence here seems to be our conceptual analysis of the wax, right? We asked, you know, well, what is it really when we get rid of the accidental properties, right? What remains? Method of subtraction again, right? Just like we used when we were trying to get to the essence of the I. So there's some conceptual analysis going on, and what we can infer from the piece of wax's identity being preserved through the process of melting. Descartes believes we can infer that we don't really know the wax through the senses, and then that supports what we get through conceptual analysis, which is seemingly that what we're really dealing with here is extension, the taking up of space. Okay, so that's a lot of takeaways and framed in terms of, okay, this is the epistemological part and this is the metaphysical part. I hope that's helpful. Now we just need to wrap all this up. We've got some concluding remarks here. We've got two main points, two main takeaways, and then some supporting points here on the slide. So first of all, when we were going into the wax meditation, Descartes made it clear that the point was to reaffirm the idea that the mind truly is better known than the body. We didn't read this part, but the motivation in the text is, but it will still seem strange to you, dear reader, that the mind, which is invisible and intangible and doesn't have any sensory properties, is better known than bodies, which do have all these vivid sensory properties. That seems strange, right? Here's this thing that you can't sense, but we know it better than all these things that you can sense. Is that really true? That's how the wax meditation begins, right? And so he just takes the piece of wax and starts examining it. The mind is better known, that's what we've concluded. The wax is extension if it exists at all. It's a bit of extension, but we don't know whether it exists when we perceive it. Then at the same time, every act of perception reaffirms that one has a mind capable of perceiving. So the mind is better known than the body because whenever we perceive an external thing or a so-called external thing, as far as we know, external thing, we're not actually sure that it's there, but we're sure we're having a perception, right? So doesn't that show that the mind is better known than the body? And different kinds of perception reveal different modes of thought, right? I could see something or smell something, and those are different kinds of perception, and so those are different modes of thought or different kinds of thought, right? And then maybe there are visible things and smelly things, or visible things and scented things, and then maybe there aren't. So I'm definitely having thoughts as if of scented things and thoughts as if of visible things. That's definitely happening. Right? So I'm sure of my mind, and I'm sure that my mind has the potential to have thoughts as if of scented things and thoughts as if of visible things. And then maybe there are visible things and scented things out there. Right? So again, the mind is better known than the body. Even as I observe external things, I learn about the kinds of thoughts I can have more firmly and more certainly than I learn about the kinds of things that are out there. Okay, so that all falls under the heading of the mind truly is better known than the body, but there's another important takeaway here. We've got this basic metaphysical picture of mind-body dualism, right? At the beginning of meditation 2, we determined that the I is a thinking thing. By the end of meditation 2, when we've gotten through the wax meditation, we realize that bodies are extended things. That's dualism. We've got two kinds of things here, right? We've got thinking things or minds, and we've got extended things or bodies, right? These are substances. Descartes throws around that term substance. What does that mean exactly? Well, a substance is something that stays the same through changes in accidental properties. So it's underlying, right? And that's what the Latin means here. Substance, standing under. It's something that's sort of under the accidental properties, staying the same while they change, right? So the mind endures through changes in thought, right? I have a thought as if of a scented thing, a thought as if of a visible thing. I have a pure thought about the nature of the I, right? The I, the mind, endures through those various modifications in thought. And then as we saw, the wax endures through various modifications in its sensory properties. In fact, all the sensory properties changed, but the wax stayed the same. So now we're looking at two different kinds of substance undergoing different kinds of modifications, right? And that's what mind-body dualism amounts to. Okay, so now we're done with meditation 2. I hope this is all clear enough. And of course, you can shoot me an email if you want to talk about it more, or you certainly can post your own question or comment in the discussion forum. Just find the right discussion for that. Don't put it as an answer to a prompt. If it's a general question looking for clarity, put it in one of the general discussions available there. All right, thank you.